The Texas heat was a physical weight on Clara Miller's shoulders, pressing down until her knees threatened to buckle. She gritted her teeth, bracing her boot against the dry earth as she hauled back on the rusted barbed wire. The metal groaned, snagging on her leather gloves, fighting her every inch of the way. It felt less like ranching and more like fighting a losing war against the elements. Beside her, the fence post leaned precariously, looking like old bones unable to support the weight of the world anymore. The wind kicked up, tossing grit into her eyes, blurring her vision, just as the wire slipped from her grip and coiled back. Into a cruel, tangled mess her younger sister, Lillian, dropped her pliers in the dirt, the dust puffing up around her boots. "It's no use, Clara," she breathed out, wiping a muddy streak of sweat across her forehead. "The storm didn't just break the line, it destroyed it. We'll never get this fixed in time." Clara didn't answer immediately. Her jaw tightened, a familiar reflex against the rising tide of panic. To admit defeat was to admit that their father's legacy was crumbling into the dry earth. The creek beds were nothing but cracked puzzles of baked mud, and their cattle, their only source of income, were already wandering toward the horizon. She was the anchor keeping this family tethered to the land, but the rope was fraying fast. She was the only thing standing between her sister and absolute ruin. That's when the horizon shifted, through the shimmering waves of heat rising off. The road, a silhouette, detached itself from the landscape. At first, it was just a shape, a dark smudge against the blinding sun. But as it moved closer, the details sharpened into focus. A rider. He sat high on a powerful roan horse, the animal's, coat matted with the dust of a long journey. The stranger rode with a slack rein, his shoulders broad and set, his hat pulled low enough to cast a shadow over his entire face. Clara wiped her palms on her skirt, her heart hammering a warning against her ribs. In this desolate corner of Texas, a lone drifter was rarely good news. He drew his horse to a halt a few yards away, the animal blowing air through its nostrils, the sound loud in the quiet afternoon. The man looked road-weary, his coat stained with travel, his posture heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years. Not dazed out with a slow, deliberate movement, he nudged the brim of his hat upward with a thumb. Clara found herself staring into eyes of piercing blue, startlingly clear against the grit and tan of his stubbled face. They were calm eyes, sharp as a mountain lake, assessing the scene without judgment. "Afternoon, ma'am," he rumbled. His voice was low and steady, a deep timbre that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. He nodded once to Clara, then to Lillian. "Looks like the weather took a heavy toll on your fence line." Clara straightened her spine, trying to look taller, more formidable. She knew how vulnerable they looked 2 women miles from the nearest town. "We're managing," she lied, her voice crisp and guarded. "No, we're not," Lillian blurted out, her desperation overriding her caution. The storm tore it all apart. "We can't keep the herd in." The stranger dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, yet moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. He was taller than Clara had realized, his frame lean but packed with corded muscle. He walked to the fence, running a gloved hand over a splintered post, testing the shattered wood with a knowledgeable touch. "This is too much work for 2 pairs of hands," he said simply, looking back at them. "I've got the right tools in my saddlebags. I could have this line standing straight again by sundown." Clara's suspicion spiked. Nothing in their world came for free, and kindness from strangers usually carried a hidden price tag. "We don't have money to pay for hired help," she said stiffly. Crossing her arms, the man met her guarded stare. He didn't look offended. Instead, a flicker of understanding passed through those blue eyes. "I didn't ask for money," he said quietly. "A hot meal and some water for my horse. That's more than enough payment for me. named Silas, Silas. The name seemed to hang in the dry air, settling the dust around them. Lillian brightened instantly, a look of pure, unmasked relief washing over her face. "We'd be grateful." "Silas," she said, already turning to run toward the well. "I'll fetch fresh water." Clara didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing through the calculations of survival versus safety. She knew the dangers of the frontier, as well as she knew the back of her own hand. 2 unmarried women living miles from civilization were easy targets, and inviting a strange man onto their property was akin to inviting a wolf into the sheep pen. But then she looked past into the horizon, where their livelihood was slowly scattering into the brush. Losing even 1 head of cattle right now could mean the difference between making it through winter or losing the farm entirely. She tightened her jaw and gave a sharp, singular nod. "You may help." Silas didn't waste a second. He set to work, with a quiet, steady purpose that spoke of discipline. He shed his heavy trail coat, hanging it on a fence post, revealing a work shirt, damp with sweat that strained against broad shoulders. He grabbed a shovel and began digging new post holes, the rhythmic thud scrape of the metal against the earth becoming the heartbeat of the afternoon. He untangled the snarled barbed wire, handling the rusted, vicious metal with a calm dexterity that only came from years of hard practice. He didn't speak unless necessary, and when he did, his words were simple, honest, and direct. Lillian hovered nearby, unable to suppress her curiosity. She watched him work with wide eyes, fascinated by the sudden change in their fortunes. "Are you a ranch hand by trade?" she asked, handing him a ladle of water. Silas paused, wiping his forehead with his forearm. "Sometimes," he answered, taking a long drink. "Other times, I do whatever work I can find. I'm headed east right now. Heard rumors of railroad jobs paying steady wages." Clara sat on the porch steps, pretending to mend a torn piece of canvas, but her needle barely moved. She wasn't fooling anyone, certainly not herself. Her eyes kept drifting back to the man working on her fence line. His silence wasn't threatening, in fact. It was steady and dependable, but she refused to let her guard down. She couldn't afford to trust him. Not now. Not when everything was so fragile. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of red and bruised gold, Lillian began to fill the silence with pieces of their life story. She chattered about how their parents had passed away 3 winters ago, leaving them to manage the estate. She spoke of their neighbor, Henderson, a man with too much land and not enough conscience, who had been trying to squeeze them out for months. She talked about the sheer exhaustion of 2 women trying to hold back the wilderness alone. Clara stiffened with every sentence Lillian spoke. Those were private wounds, family business that had no place in the ears of a drifter. But Silas just listened. He didn't offer pity, which Clara would have hated. Instead, he showed a quiet respect. "You've done well to hold this place," Silas said during a pause, driving the final staple into a fresh post. Clara froze, her needle hovering over the canvas. No one had ever said that to her. Not once. Everyone else only saw what was broken, what was failing. She looked away quickly, the praise feeling almost too heavy to bear. Unsure of how to process the validation. By the time night fell, the fence was restored. It stood straight and strong against the twilight, a dark, clean line of order in a chaotic world. Inside the small cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Clara set supper on the table, the warm yellow glow of the kerosene lamp softening the hard edges of their rough existence. Silas sat at the table hesitantly, like a man who wasn't used to being invited indoors. He ate slowly, savoring every bite with a gratitude that suggested he had missed more meals than he had eaten lately. Lillian kept the conversation alive, asking him about the towns he'd seen and the people he'd met on the road. Silas answered. in short, careful sentences. Clara noticed something else, though. She noticed the way his eyes kept flicking to the dark window, as if he were constantly listening for something outside. A man like Silas carried his past the way other men carried. Saddlebags heavy, worn, and always right there beside him. When the last scraping of forks against tin plates died down, Clara stood up, signaling the end of the evening. "You'll sleep in the barn," she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "There are spare blankets in the loft. It's dry and warm enough." Silas nodded slowly, rising from the bench. "Thank you, ma'am, for the meal and the hospitality." He stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the small room. Suddenly, the cabin felt strangely emptier, somehow, than it had been before he arrived. The air felt still, lacking the charge his presence had brought. Clara moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just an inch. Across the dark yard, a soft orange glow bloomed in the loft window of the barn. His light, a stranger's light in her sanctuary. It was a piece of the outside world she had tried so hard to keep at bay, now burning steadily on her property. In the stillness of that Texas night, Clara felt a shift in the tectonic plates of her life. It was a tremor, faint but undeniable, beginning of something she wasn't ready to name, let alone face. But ready or not, it had already begun. The next morning, the sun hadn't yet breached the horizon when Silas found Clara already at the barn. She was wrestling with the main door, her boots slipping in the dirt as she tried to force it open. The wood was swollen, and the bottom hinge was rusted through, dangling uselessly. She heaved against it, her breath coming in short, frustrated puffs, but the iron wouldn't hold. "That hinge has gone soft with rot," Silas's voice rumbled from behind her. Clara jumped, spinning around, her hand instinctively going to her side. She hadn't heard him approach over the sound of her own struggle. Her eyes narrowed, the guard walls slamming back up instantly. She wanted him gone. She wanted her world to return to the simple, manageable misery it had been before he rode in. But the reality was staring her in the face. A hinge was broken, the axe was dull, and every single day was a battle she was barely winning. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers, his expression calm. "I can fix it," he said. "I'll work for my keep. I don't want your money, Clara. Just a roof for my horse and a plate at your table. Give me a few days to get things square, and I'll be out of your hair." It was the kind of offer a woman alone should never accept. It broke every rule of propriety and safety. But Clara wasn't just alone. She was drowning. She looked at the broken door, then at the capable man standing before her. "All right," she said softly, the fight draining out of her. Just for a few days. Silas stayed. And with his presence, the rhythm of the farm underwent a transformation. It wasn't just the work being done. It was the quality of it. Silas sharpened the dull tools until they sang. He replaced the weak rails on the corral that Clara had been propping up for months. He cut new fence posts that looked like they would last for a generation. He moved through their land with a quiet reverence, as if he understood the soil and respected the struggle it took to tame it. But the farm wasn't the only thing that took notice of the change. The world around them was watching. 2.1 blistering afternoon. Clara looked up from hauling heavy buckets of water to the trough. A movement on the ridge caught her eye. It was Henderson, their greedy neighbor. He sat atop his bay horse, silhouetted against the bright sky like a vulture perched on a cliff edge. He didn't wave. He didn't ride down to offer greetings. He just sat there immobile, watching Silas repair the roof of the shed. Clara's stomach tightened into a knot. Henderson was a man who smelled weakness like a shark smelled blood, but now he was looking at something new strength. And he didn't. Look pleased. Asterisk. By the time the sun rose the next day, the poison of gossip had already seeped into the soil of the local town. When Clara rode in for their weekly supplies, she felt the change in the air immediately. It was heavy, suffocating. As she walked down the wooden boardwalk, two women she had known since childhood suddenly stopped their conversation, falling into a pointed, icy silence as she passed. Inside the general store, the shift was even more painful. The storekeeper, a man who used to give her rock candy when she was a little girl, wouldn't meet her eyes. He tallied her order with stiff, mechanical movements, speaking to her as if she were a stranger passing through, not a neighbor. Outside, men on the street looked right through her, or worse, exchanged knowing smirks. The narrative was written, and the town was eating it up. Two vulnerable women living alone on a remote ranch with a strange, rough-looking man. It was the kind of scandalous story the West loved to whisper about behind cupped hands. Clara carried the heavy sack of flour back to her wagon with her chin held high, refusing to let them see her bleed. But inside, she felt hollowed out. That night, the tension in the cabin finally snapped. Lillian turned on her sister, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and humiliation. "You're the one who always talks about propriety, Clara. You wanted him gone the moment he arrived, but now you let him stay. And now the whole town thinks we single quotes that we're—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, the shame burning too hot in her cheeks. Clara's voice cracked under the weight of the accusation. "We need his help, Lillian. The ranch is falling apart." "Or maybe you need him," Lillian snapped back, her eyes wet with hurt. "Maybe you just want him here." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. They didn't speak again until morning, retreating to their separate corners of grief. But the land didn't care about their reputation or their arguments. It demanded work. The days that followed were a blur of grueling labor. They spent hours rounding up stray cattle from the scrub, repairing the damage from the storm, and working until sweat soaked through their clothes and dirt was ground into their skin. Silas worked alongside them through every aching hour. And in the crucible of that hard labor, something new began to form between him and Clara. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, a quiet trust, a shared rhythm of strength. They moved in sync, anticipating each other's needs without words. Lillian saw it, and it sparked something dangerous and desperate inside her. She began to interject herself into their dynamic. She started bringing Silas fresh water from the well, even when his canteen was still full. She stood a little too close when he was teaching them how to mend a broken saddle strap. She laughed, too loud at his smallest comments, her heart reaching out for him with a young woman's frantic hope for attention. One morning, Silas was showing Clara how to brace a weak wall on the chicken coop. "If we angle the support beam here," he explained, pointing to the joint, "it'll hold against the wind better." "That's a good idea," Clara nodded, seeing the logic. Lillian appeared suddenly, her face tight. "You always think his ideas are good," she snapped, her voice shrill. "I suggested fixing that wall weeks ago, and you ignored me. You tried to send him away, but now you hang on his every word." "Lillian, don't," Silas said gently, stepping back to give them space. But the dam had broken. Lillian turned and ran back toward the house, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Silas watched her go, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "I didn't mean to cause trouble between you two," he said quietly. "The trouble was already there," Clara sighed, watching her sister's retreating figure. "You just brought it to the surface." That night, the weather turned violent again. A storm rolled in off the plains, a roaring beast that cracked the sky open with blinding white flashes of lightning. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing across the prairie. Suddenly, the high-pitched yipping of coyotes cut through the key. Thunder, they were too close, and the cattle were panicking. Clara grabbed the old shotgun from above the mantel and ran out into the chaos. The darkness swallowed her instantly. Before she could get her bearings, a torch flared in the yard. Silas was already there, the firelight fighting back the wind. "I heard the pack," he shouted over the gale. "I thought you might be coming out here." They patrolled the perimeter together, the torch in Silas's hand casting wild, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted against the barn walls. Clara's grip on the shotgun was white-knuckled, her breath hitching in her chest. She wasn't just reacting to the storm. She was vibrating with years of accumulated anxiety. "You never stop scanning the horizon, do you?" Silas asked, his voice cutting through the wind as he checked a latch. "You're always waiting for the next blow to fall." Clara stopped, turning to him, her hair whipped across her face by the gale. "I don't have the luxury of resting," she whispered, though the wind carried her voice straight to him. "Out here, if you blink, something breaks. A fence goes down, a calf dies, the rain stops. It feels like this land gives us just enough hope to keep us going, only to snatch it away when we're not looking. It's a game I'm tired of losing." Silas really looked at her, in a way that made Clara feel exposed and seen all at once. "I know what that weight feels like, Clara. I know what it is to lose everything you've built." He stepped closer. The torchlight flickered, illuminating the rugged lines of his face and the genuine empathy in his eyes. The distance between them shrank until they were inches apart, sheltered in the lee of the barn while the world roared around them. "But look around," he said softly. "The fence is holding. The stock is safe. You aren't facing this storm by yourself." Tonight, in that small, fragile circle of firelight, the air seemed to thicken. The chaos of the weather faded into the background, replaced by a terrifying magnetic pull. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. His nearness, his warmth, solid strength of his presence, it was intoxicating. For a heartbeat, she leaned in, a yearning she thought she had buried years ago, rising to the surface. But before the moment could crest, the sky split open with a deafening crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath their boots. The spell shattered. Clara gasped, pulling back as if burned. Overwhelmed by her own vulnerability, she turned and fled back to the safety of the cabin, leaving Silas standing alone in the swirling dark. He watched her go, the torchlight reflecting in his eyes, knowing that the walls she had built around her heart were finally beginning to crack. The real trouble, however, didn't come from the weather. It arrived 2 days later, under a blindingly bright sun. Henderson rode straight into their yard, but this time he wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 men with pistols on their hips, and a 4th rider, a man in a stiff black wool suit who looked entirely out of place on the dusty frontier. Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart sinking. Lillian stood just behind her, clutching the doorframe. Over by the corral, Silas stopped his work. He didn't move toward them, but his body went perfectly still, his eyes tracking the group with the alertness of a predator. "Miller," Henderson barked, dispensing with any pretense of neighborly kindness. "I told you this day would come. Your time is up." The man in the suit dismounted awkwardly and stepped forward, unbuckling a leather satchel with clinical detachment. "Miss Clara Miller," he announced, his voice dry and nasal. "I am serving you with a writ of temporary seizure regarding this estate, citing gross neglect and mismanagement of resources. Under the county statutes, you are ordered to vacate the premises by sundown." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The air left her lungs. It felt as though the earth had suddenly dropped away beneath her feet. Everything she loved, her parents' legacy, her home, her purpose, was being ripped away with a few cold, legal words. Silas walked toward them then. His stride was slow, deliberate. "Let me see the writ." Henderson threw his head back and laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "Who are you to ask anything, stable boy?" Silas ignored him completely, his gaze locked on the lawyer. The man in the suit hesitated, intimidated by the sheer intensity of the cowboy approaching him, and nervously handed over the document. Silas read it once. Then he read it again. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked up, and his voice was dangerously calm. "This writ is worthless. Asterisk, this paper isn't worth the ink it's stamped with," Silas stated flatly, his voice carrying across the yard with the weight of absolute certainty. He flicked the document with a finger. "It wasn't issued after a formal inspection or a hearing. It's a rubber-stamped job. I'd bet my horse this came from Judge Calloway, didn't it?" The lawyer stiffened, snatching the paper back as if Silas's touch had burned it. "That is irrelevant. The judge's authority is. The judge is a crook." Silas cut in, his voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. "He pulled this exact same stunt on my father 5 years ago. He used a vague neglect clause to seize a fully operational farm, just to hand it over to a cattle baron with deep pockets. I spent the last 2 years in libraries and courthouses, reading every statute I could find, learning exactly how he steals land so I could stop him from doing it again." Henderson's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "You think you can stand against me, boy? You're a drifter with nothing to his name." "I'm standing right here," Silas replied, not backing down an inch. "And I'm telling you, this seizure is illegal." A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the group. Henderson's hand drifted toward his hip, his eyes narrowing. But before the violence could erupt, the sound of galloping hooves broke the tension. Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper who had turned his back on Clara in town, rode up the track on his gray mare. "That's enough, Henderson," Abernathy shouted, pulling his horse to a halt between the two groups. "You've gone too far this time," Henderson sputtered, caught off guard. "This is none of your business, Abernathy. Go back to your counter." "It became my business when you started spreading lies about these girls to drive down their land value," Abernathy shot back, his face stern. "I might have listened to the gossip before, and for that I'm ashamed. But I won't stand by and watch. You robbed them in broad daylight. This land stays theirs." Henderson looked from Silas's defiant stance to Abernathy's resolute glare. He realized the tide had turned. He had lost the element of surprise and public support. "You'll regret this," Henderson spat at Clara. "All of you." He jerked his reins, spinning his horse around violently. "Let's go." His men scrambled to follow, the lawyer clutching his briefcase like a shield as they galloped away in a cloud of dust. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour, her knees nearly giving way with relief. But her relief was short-lived. That night, the external threat was gone, but a storm of a different kind erupted inside the cabin. The tension that had been simmering between the sisters finally boiled over. Lillian stood by the fireplace, her back rigid. When she turned, her face was wet with tears, her expression twisted with betrayal. "You played the martyr, Clara," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You told me he was dangerous. You told me to keep my distance. You made me feel foolish for looking at him." Clara shook her head, stepping forward. "Lillian, please. I was trying to protect us. To protect you. Protect me?" Lillian laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You warned me about my reputation. Well, you were the one sneaking out to meet him in the dark. You wanted him gone, but the moment you saw I cared for him, suddenly he had to stay. You couldn't stand the thought of me having something of my own, could you?" "That's not true," Clara pleaded, her heart aching at the accusation. "I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't planned, ... It just happened." "You stole the only hope I had," Lillian said, wiping her eyes angrily. "You took him for yourself." "I didn't take anything," Clara insisted. Lillian turned away, staring into the dying fire, her voice barely a ghost of a whisper. "You already did, Clara. You just won't admit it." The silence inside the cabin was heavier than the timber beams holding up the roof. For days, Clara and Lillian moved around each other like ghosts, performing their chores with a mechanical efficiency that masked the deep fracture between them. But while their home felt broken, the land did not stop demanding their attention. They worked through the pain, side by side in the fields, letting the rhythm of labor serve as the only conversation they could manage. A week later, the day of reckoning arrived. The hearing was held in the town's small white chapel, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. It seemed the entire county had turned out, drawn by the spectacle of the Miller sisters fighting for their survival. The air inside was stifling, thick with dust and the murmur of curious gossip. Henderson sat at the front table, looking like a king holding court. He leaned back in his chair, whispering to his polished city lawyer, a smug grin plastered across his face. He looked at Clara and Lillian not as opponents, but as nuisances he had already swatted away. On the other side of the aisle, Clara sat, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Lillian sat beside her, pale and quiet, while Silas and Mr. Abernathy's attorney, a weathered man named Elias, organized their papers. The proceedings began, and Henderson's lawyer Davies wasted no time. He painted a picture of Clara and Lillian that was insulting in its simplicity. He described them as helpless, overwhelmed spinsters, drowning in a task meant for men. He claimed the ranch was a hazard, a wasteland of neglect that devalued the entire district. He pointed a finger at Silas, dismissing him as a transient vagrant with no standing and no skills. It was a brutal, humiliating performance. Clara felt every eye in the room boring into her back, judging her, pitying her. Then it was Elias's turn. He didn't bluster or shout. He simply called Silas to the stand. Silas walked to the front of the room. He wore his only clean shirt, his hat, held respectfully in his hands. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like the earth itself, solid, unshakable. He didn't try to mimic the fancy language of the city attorney. He spoke with the plain, rough cadence of the frontier. "I'm not a man of letters," Silas began, his voice carrying to the back pews, "but I know what I see. And I know the law, because I had to learn it." He told the room a story they hadn't expected. He spoke of his own father, a good man who had lost his farm years ago, to a scheme identical to Henderson's. He spoke of the helplessness he felt as a young man watching. His family's legacy stolen by a gavel and a lie. He explained how he had spent every spare hour since then reading legal statutes in boarding houses and libraries, obsessed with understanding the machinery of injustice, so it could never happen to him again. "I've walked every inch of the Miller fence line," Silas said, turning to look Henderson in the eye. "I've seen the work these women do. They fight harder for that land than any cattleman in this room. That ranch isn't failing because of neglect. It's struggling because of a drought and a storm acts of God, not women. The only mismanagement here is a neighbor who thinks his greed is a legal argument." The room went deathly silent. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the light streaming through the windows. Silas's words had cut through the pretense, exposing the ugly truth at the heart of the case. The judge, a stern man with a bushy gray beard, looked from Henderson's red, sputtering face to Clara's hopeful eyes. He cleared his throat and leaned forward. "The petition for emergency seizure is denied," the judge boomed. "The Miller deed stands valid and untouched. Furthermore, Mr. Henderson, you are hereby ordered to cease all harassment of these women, legal or otherwise. If I see you in my court regarding this property again, I will hold you in contempt." A gavel struck the wood with a sound like a gunshot-sharp, final, and liberating dot. It was over. They had won. The ride back to the farm felt surreal. The wagon rattled over the bumps, but the air felt lighter, sweeter. The dust settled behind them, and the fences they had worked so hard to fix stood tall against the horizon. The world felt safe again, the threat that had loomed over them for so long finally dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Back at the house, as the adrenaline faded, clarity began to return. Lillian, who had spent the ride home in deep thought, watched Clara and Silas unload the wagon. She saw the way they moved together, not with the frantic energy of a secret affair, but with the quiet, sturdy partnership of two people building a life. The jealousy that had clouded her vision began to lift, replaced by a somber realization ** that evening. The air on the porch was cool, carrying the scent of sage and settling dust. Clara sat on the wooden steps, watching Silas in the distance as he oiled the hinges of the gate he had just repaired. She didn't hear Lillian approach until her sister sat down beside her, their shoulders brushing lightly. There was no anger left in Lillian's face, only a quiet newfound maturity. She watched Silas work for a long moment before speaking. "I was wrong, you know," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the chirping crickets. I think I was trying to make him into something he wasn't. I wanted an escape, Clara. I wanted a way out of this hard life, and I thought he was the key to a door I couldn't open myself." Clara turned to look at her sister, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and lingering sadness. "We all want things to be easier, Lily." "No, it's more than that." Lillian shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "He was never my escape. He was your equal. I saw the way you two looked at each other in the courtroom. You're made of the same stuff iron and earth. You deserve that kind of strength beside you." She took Clara's rough hand in hers, squeezing it tight. "You deserve to be happy, sister. And I think he's the man who can finally let you rest." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. The invisible wall that had risen between them crumbled completely, washing away in the evening. Light change came quickly after that. It wasn't a fracture, but a natural growth, like a seed pod bursting to spread its contents. 2 weeks later, Lillian packed a small, battered trunk. She had written to a cousin in a town 200 miles east and secured a position she had secretly dreamed of for years, an apprenticeship at a dress shop with the possibility of teaching at the local schoolhouse. It was a life of fabric, books, and town squares, far away from the brutal demands of cattle ranching. "You'll write every week," Clara commanded, her voice thick with the threat of tears as they stood by the wagon. "I promise," Lillian said, hugging her fiercely. "And you'll tell me everything about the harvest." Silas stepped forward and lifted the heavy trunk into the back of the wagon with a single easy motion. He turned to Lillian, tipping his hat. She looked at him, then at Clara, and finally hugged him too. "Take care of her, Silas," she whispered, the request heavy with meaning. "With my life," he answered, and his voice left no room for doubt. Watched until the wagon was nothing more than a speck of dust on the horizon, disappearing into the vastness of the Texas plains. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. She felt the land around her, vast and open, but not threatening. She stood alone with Silas. The prairie stretched out around them, golden and endless under the midday sun. A warm breeze drifted across the fields, rustling the dry grass. Silas turned to look at the patch of land he had spent the last week clearing of stones and scrub. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. "That soil is rich. I'm thinking of planting corn when the rains come next month." Clara smiled softly, looking at the man who had ridden out of the heat and changed everything. "We'll need a better plow for that kind of work." "I'll build one," he said simply. It wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. There was no ring, no bended knee. But it was something stronger. It was a promise of labor, of seasons to come, of a future built with their own 4 hands. It was a promise of a life together. The next morning, the sun rose bright and fierce, casting long beams of light across the ranch. The light caught the barbed wire of the fence Silas had rebuilt on that very first day. The metal shone like silver, and the posts stood deep, straight, and unyielding against the wind. It was no longer just a boundary line. It was a symbol. It marked the place where a Western love story began, not with grand gestures, but with work. It was the mark of the cowboy who fixed their fence for free, and in doing so, mended a broken family and found a home in the heart of a woman who thought she was destined to walk the path alone forever.